Well, it's very lonely. Being a woman in this industry, in my opinion, is extremely lonely.
Our next guest is a singer who may be new to you, but I promise you that you're going to be hearing much more from her soon.
Would you welcome, please, Miss Phyllis Hyman.
Phyllis Hyman?
Phyllis Hyman.
Phyllis Hyman!
That America's biggest new star will be Miss Phyllis Hyman.
Nobody sounds like Phyllis.
I'm over 6 feet tall.
Yeah.
I'm not a thin woman. I'm not afraid to laugh and to have a lot of fun. I'm not very quiet.
What hit the music world today, R&B singer Phyllis Hyman was found dead in her apartment this afternoon.
The 45-year-old Hyman was supposed to sing at the Apollo Theater tonight.
Music world lost somebody very important.
Yeah.
Very important tonight.
On the afternoon of June 30th, 1995, at around 2:15 p.m., a woman was discovered lifeless in her bed. The coroner would determine the cause of death to be an overdose of sleeping pills. Yet, the true cause ran much deeper, hidden in the complex layers of her life. This is her story.
My experience with music was limited. I did not listen to music consciously. I listened in the car. I listened if I went to someone's home like yours. I didn't have a record player in my home. There was a radio there, but I was a television person, and I read a lot. I read a great deal.
To understand this story and to understand Phyllis Hyman, we need to go all the way back to the 1940s, when Philip Hyman, an Army veteran, met Louise Lively, a waitress. A short time after meeting, on July 6, 1949, their first daughter, Phyllis Linda Hyman, was born. Soon after her birth, the family moved to Pittsburgh, where they settled in the St. Clair Village public housing projects. Over the next few years, Phyllis's family expanded rapidly. She would become the oldest of 7 children, and her father's railroad job kept him away from home often. As his health declined due to a back problem, he began to drink heavily, adding tension to an already troubled household. Louise was battling her own mental health issues and struggled to care for her children, leaving Phyllis's younger sister Jeannie to take on motherly responsibilities.
Did you always want to be a singer?
No.
You didn't?
My dream as a child was to be a rich, successful, single, childless, Afro-American woman.
Despite the chaos around her, Phyllis had a powerful presence, and she wasn't shy about asserting control over her siblings. Known for her intimidating demeanor, Phyllis instilled a mixture of respect and fear among the other Hyman children. She attended Carrick High School. Tall and striking, she stood out not only for her 6-foot-tall stature, but also for her unique talent. Phyllis joined the school choir where her powerful voice drew attention, yet the spotlight was intimidating. Though she loved singing, her family had never encouraged her to pursue it seriously, and thus, she wasn't naturally drawn to the spotlight. As Phyllis grew older, her resentment toward her mother intensified. She couldn't understand why Louise had so many children she couldn't take care of properly, and the lack of affection from her mother affected Phyllis deeply. After high school, she joined a vocal group, Sounds of Ebony, which helped her ease into performing despite her persistent stage fright. She also earned a scholarship to Robert Morris College, becoming the first person at the institution to receive a scholarship for music. Phyllis's choir teacher, David Tamburi, saw her potential and gave her private lessons, while his family helped refine her image, capping her teeth, selecting her clothes, and taking her to nightclubs to practice her stage presence. However, after a year, Phyllis left college, became a secretary, and began indulging in heavy drinking and pills. Soon after, she was recruited to sing with a touring group, The New Directions, which took her on the road, where she adjusted to performing while dealing with bouts of insecurity. Phyllis just didn't think she was good enough to make it, and eventually gigs for New Directions slowed.
And then Nancy Wilson, I just thought she was the premier vocalist. I thought, if you can't sing like Nancy, don't bother. And of course, I didn't get in the business for a while because of that. I just thought she was the best singer ever. I sang in clubs and things like that, but I couldn't imagine being a professional singer because I didn't think I had anything to offer.
After spending some time returning to normalcy as a live-in babysitter, Phyllis decided to audition for another group named All the People. This new group was based in Miami, and by 1973, Phyllis had made a name for herself in the city. One night, Bob Fosse came to town.
Who is it?
Who is it? Who is it?
Who is it?
Who is it?
By 1973, Bob Fosse was a household name, having cut his teeth as an esteemed choreographer, creating the movement for Broadway shows like Sweet Charity and winning a Tony for his choreography for the Broadway show Redhead. While in Miami shooting the Lenny Bruce biopic, he made an appearance in the crowd at one of Phyllis's shows, and drawn to not only her talent but her striking beauty, he asked her to make a cameo. It was a quick part, with no speaking role, but it was an impressive credit to add to her growing resume. While in Miami, Phyllis sang for an array of bands including the Hondo Beat, who played weekends on cruise ships. One night, while in her cabin, she heard a voice she was drawn to. She peeked out to see Larry Alexander. Larry was the physical manifestation of everything Phyllis dreamed about. When they eventually got to know each other, Phyllis learned that he was also a singer on the ship, and they became fast friends. By 1974, Phyllis would start a band of her own. Comprised of different musicians she'd met over the years, the PH Factor played an assortment of music from funk to Latin. Larry would come along sometimes, acting as Phyllis's personal chauffeur, and by this time he had become Phyllis's live-in boyfriend as well. While doing gigs at the Cahoots Lounge, she met Sid Mauer, who convinced her to sign to his record label, Desert Moon Records. They began to work on a few cuts, but Phyllis and the rest of her band didn't particularly like the direction Desert Moon and the producers they had acquired were taking her. Phyllis had a natural musicality and could do just about anything with her voice. According to her biography, Strength of a Woman, the record she was recording for this new label seemed to be overproduced. Desert Moon and producer George Kerr, who by this time wasn't just Phyllis's boyfriend but her manager now, had acquired for Phyllis, wanted her to sing the trendy disco tunes of the day. But Phyllis was more into the timeless sounds of jazz and R&B. She sang what she was told to sing, but it just didn't come out right. By December 1975, the PH Factor had moved to New York City, in which they acquired a long-term gig at Russ Brown's nightclub. Composer Norman Connors attended a show, and once he saw Phyllis, he knew she would be great for his next album. And he had the perfect song for her. Originally recorded by Connie Stevens under the name Keep Growing Strong, the Stylistics had covered the tune and changed the name to Betcha by Golly Wow. And although it reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, Phyllis had never heard of it. Once he got permission from her label, Norman and Phyllis recorded 3 tracks for his new album.
And you got your first big break with Norman Connors.
Yes, and I met Norman in New York City in a small club. And so he asked me to do the Starship album, which just turned out gold, and of course took me to Buddha.
You Are My Starship was released in 1976, and Norman had asked Phyllis to join him on his summer concert tour. The first single, We Both Need Each Other, featured both Phyllis and Michael Henderson and peaked at number 23 on the R&B charts. Around this time, trying to ride off the momentum of this release, Desert Moon Records released a solo Phyllis single titled Baby I'm Gonna Love You. The song peaked at number 76 on the R&B charts. While on tour, Norman began convincing Phyllis and Larry to sign to Buddha Records. It was the label he was on, and also the home of Gladys Knight and the Pips. Norman acted as a pseudo-musical director for the label, and he eventually convinced Phyllis and Larry to leave Desert Moon and move over to Buddha.
Hi, now we just sought out the most beautiful girl in the place, and we're going to find out who she is and wonder if she's singing for us tonight. Tell us your name.
Phyllis Hyman.
And you're a performer?
Yes, I'm with Buddha Records.
And you're a singer?
Yes, working on my first album.
That's fantastic.
By January 1977, Betcha by Golly Wow was released as a single, and it peaked at number 29 on the R&B charts. But the same year she came on board, Buddha was already on the decline. The thing that lured Phyllis to Buddha was creative control, something she didn't necessarily have at her previous label, and something she craved in every part of her life, ever since she was a child. Buddha kept their end of the bargain. Her and Larry were able to craft their album in the way they wanted to. Larry helped write and produce, but he wasn't a producer like Quincy Jones, and the radio wasn't dying for any records from him. This made the self-titled album hard to market, because Phyllis and the producers she used were virtually unknown nationwide. The album was released in April 1977 to mixed reviews. Stereo Review said, "Her producers have wrought a miracle in reverse by managing to make her sound like just about everybody else." The first single from the album, Lovin' You Losin' You, reached number 32 on the R&B charts, and the album in itself peaked at number 49. Phyllis toured throughout the year to promote the album, but it stalled on the charts and wasn't a commercial success. In 1978, Phyllis and her producer-manager boyfriend Larry began to work on her sophomore album. Larry produced the entire album with co-producer Skip Scarborough. Sing a Song was released in 1978, and according to Billboard, failed to chart. This wasn't due to the album itself, though. By the time the album came out, Buddha Records was defunct.
My next guest has nurtured such superstars as Barry Manilow, Melissa Manchester, Chicago, Simon and Garfunkel.
Clive Davis.
Clive Davis. Probably the most knowledgeable man the record business has ever known. The president of Arista, Clive Davis.
Clive Davis had risen from attorney to music executive. Starting at CBS Records as assistant counsel, he rose up the ranks to become president of the Columbia Records subsidiary, where he eventually signed the likes of Janis Joplin, Earth, Wind and Fire, and Aretha Franklin, in which became one of Clive's biggest regrets. Columbia didn't know what to do with Aretha. She would leave the label just before Clive became president, and moved on to Atlantic, where she had major success with hits like I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, and her biggest song, the Otis Redding cover, Respect. Then came the scandal. In '73, Davis was fired from the company for payola, tax evasion, and allegedly misappropriating up to $94,000 in company funds. This included $50,000 to remodel his apartment and at least $20,000 to fund his son's bar mitzvah, in which he claimed on his receipts to CBS was a party for Liza Minnelli that never happened. He was also charged for allegedly spearheading a payola scheme in which Columbia spent $250,000 to pay black radio stations to play their artists. By 1976, Clive pleaded guilty to 1 count of tax evasion and subjected to paying a $10,000 fine. During the scandal, he founded Arista Records. The label signed the likes of Barry Manilow and Melissa Manchester. By 1978, Arista acquired Buddha Records and subsequently signed Phyllis to the label, which included a $50,000 advance.
We're inundated with commercials in this country, and some of them leave a mark on us, and you are responsible for a lot of them. How about singing some of the commercials for them? Give them an idea of some of them.
Without saying the name, of course, is probably something that we eat a lot of. 200 million people, no two are quite the same. Each doing things their own way, each plays a different game. But folks who like things their way, well, they come to Burger King.
Clive was a fan of Phyllis. He knew she had all the right ingredients to become a star, and he was a star maker. But Phyllis, on the other hand, wasn't happy with the signing. Buddha was a small label, and she had control there. At a label like Arista, with its big distribution and the commandeering presence of Clive, she was losing the control she had at the previous label. Because of Sing a Song's lackluster performance commercially and on the charts, Clive decided it was a good idea to pull it from the shelves and revamp the album. And he wanted Barry Manilow, the label's premier artist, to be involved in the production process. With this new label came new opportunities, and Phyllis was also tapped to be an ambassador for Revlon Cosmetics. While in the midst of all this change, Phyllis flew to Florida and married Larry in a small ceremony in September 1978. It's reported that no one in her family attended.
Somewhere in my lifetime, it was you.
Her revamped sophomore album, Somewhere in My Lifetime, was released on January 10, 1979. 6 of the tracks on the album were already on Sing a Song, and the album peaked at number 15 on the R&B charts and number 70 on the pop charts. The title track, the one song produced by Barry on the album, peaked at number 12 on the R&B charts, marking her biggest hit yet. But Clive wasn't happy. He was expecting Manilow and Phyllis's talents to produce a mega hit. And since his flub with Aretha, Clive had desperately wanted a hit female R&B act. He wanted to get Phyllis back in the studio as soon as possible. But Clive didn't want Barry to produce for her again, even though their previous song worked. Instead, he delegated Manilow to work with Dionne Warwick, the label's newest artist. And while Barry only produced 1 song for Phyllis, Clive let him produce Dionne's entire album. Phyllis wanted to bring Quincy Jones in for production, but Clive said no. This would be an everlasting conflict between the two, as they both wanted power over Phyllis's career. Phyllis's 4th album, You Know How to Love Me, was produced by James M. Tumey and Reggie Lucas, and was released on October 23, 1979, just 9 months after her previous release. The album performed better than her previous, peaking at number 10 on the R&B charts. The title track, the first single, peaked at number 12 on the Hot Black Singles charts.
Why don't you introduce the lady then? Well, I'll just introduce her by saying that America's biggest new star will be Miss Phyllis Hyman.
But it seems as if the label didn't know what to do with her. Dionne already had her image carved out when she came to them, and thus Clive was able to set her up for success with the label. But Phyllis was something different. She wasn't quite R&B, but she wasn't quite jazz either, and Phyllis refused to go full pop even though Clive had aspirations to. She was something unique altogether, and marketing departments and execs didn't know where to place her. And while some at the label wanted to put out more singles and market Phyllis's album accordingly, Clive seemed to be giving up. She refused to conform to his wants, and he thought she was difficult to work with. Phyllis thought he was intentionally misunderstanding what she wanted out of her career. He wanted to sell records while she wanted to have control of her own artistry, and sometimes those two things don't mix well. Phyllis and Clive were like oil and water, and although Phyllis had the makings of a superstar, something Clive clearly saw in her, she refused to bend to his will and do the things he thought would help her reach that success. But something else was fueling that resentment. Fear. Like the crippling stage fright that hindered her during her younger years, Phyllis was seemingly scared of the success that doing the things other people wanted would obtain. She told Blues and Soul magazine, "I think that up to this point I may not have put forth all the effort to make it happen totally, because I maybe had a fear of getting too big. And that's maybe made me a little laid back. Whether it was fear or rebellion, by the time her second album on Arista came out, Phyllis added coke to her cocktail of alcohol and pills. She allegedly told others that Larry introduced her to the drug to take her mind off the stress of the business.
Larry and Phyllis, not all the time, but there was some verbal battles because I would come to their house and I'd hear it. It wasn't an easy situation.
Speaking of Larry, he and Phyllis's relationship was becoming more contentious as the years went on, with many onlookers seeing the cracks in their foundation. Around this time, she decided to terminate a pregnancy, deciding it wasn't the right time for motherhood. She never envisioned that life for herself anyways. The year was 1980, and Angela Bofill had just signed to Arista in an attempt to move into the mainstream. She and Phyllis were similar in nature. Both had a jazz sound and, in my opinion, looked like they could be distant cousins. The one thing that separated them, though, was the way they worked with Clive. Angela was cooperative with his demands, unlike Phyllis, who wanted control at every step. Clive took a liking to Angela, and in turn she became the priority over Phyllis. This created tension between the two ladies, especially Phyllis, who was intentionally being overlooked for another artist. Angela gave Clive the leeway to be the puppet master of her time at Arista, but even though she was willing to work with him, she never saw the success both she and Clive were hoping for. Clive would get his R&B diva, though, sooner or later.
An irresistible force and a dazzling musical legacy come together in a stunning Broadway explosion of music, song, and dance.
Don't be a thing if it ain't got that swing. Do-a-do-a-do-a-do-a-do-a-do-a-do-a.
While Phyllis was doing a gig in New York, pianist Lloyd Myers was in the crowd. He was the musical director for a new revue in town based on the sounds of Duke Ellington, and knew Phyllis and her voice would be perfect for it. She just needed to audition for its producers. Jason Michael writes in Strength of a Woman that Phyllis was a wreck the day of the audition. The night before, she binged, and she was so hungover that she had to reschedule for later in the day. But when she got there, she nailed it. Phyllis had never been in theater, nevertheless on Broadway, and this was an entirely new world she was embarking on. And Clive didn't want her to do it, knowing that it would temporarily stunt the progress of her recording career. But in October 1980, she began rehearsals for Sophisticated Ladies. By the time the musical opened on Broadway in March 1981, Larry and Phyllis were separated due to the many issues that plagued their relationship. For one, Larry wanted children, something that Phyllis wasn't ready to pause her career to pursue. Larry also had ambitions of being a star, and managing Phyllis only dimmed his light. This reportedly bothered her, and as they kept working together, the attraction she had for him dwindled, causing Phyllis to just not want him anymore.
I really am scared. I'm signing Hyman Phyllis. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Don't forget, keep your fingers crossed.
Phyllis Hyman, a very successful recording artist, is making her Broadway debut in Sophisticated Ladies.
Sophisticated Ladies was a hit. Phyllis was nominated for the Tony Award for Best Supporting Actress in a Musical and won a Theatre World Award for Best Newcomer. But, just like everything else in her life, Phyllis did things on her own terms. She was regularly late to shows, and sometimes her late-night partying left her unable to get out of bed for the matinee. Despite her significant talent, Phyllis's fears and insecurities about success continued to haunt her. As her marriage with Larry dissolved, she became increasingly isolated, turning to substances for comfort.
I know it's a lot of hard work being in a show like that, but how do you combine being a successful recording artist, a Broadway star, and a brand new album out?
To capitalize off her newfound Broadway success, Arista wanted to put out a Phyllis album as soon as possible. She wanted to title the album Sunshine in My Life, but Clive made the move to name it Can't We Fall in Love Again, in which, like most things, Phyllis did not agree with. The album was produced by Norman Connors and released in June 1981. Clive, seemingly impressed with the fame she had acquired during her Broadway stint, put time and effort into the album and ample money into the marketing budgets. But the efforts didn't entirely pay off, and the album peaked at number 11 on the R&B charts, missing the top 10 by an inch. Phyllis got her first top 10 single on this album, though. The title track made it to number 9 on the charts.
How does Phyllis Hyman survive being out here on the road, a single, attractive woman, and keeping her head on straight, if there's such a term?
Men don't talk to female singers, so there's no problem. I have no problem whatsoever.
Is there a particular reason for that?
I don't know. Men just don't talk to female singers. I have no idea. I'm told, people tell me it's because they're intimidated and they're afraid to say anything, and they also feel I already have somebody. Well, I do have someone, but he's in Philadelphia. He thoroughly understands. You know, and what is a person going to do? I'm not going to do much more than talk or maybe have dinner with someone or a drink or something like that. I do like male company. That'd be a weirdo if I said I didn't. But men never talk to female singers. Not as a rule. Only a real brave man. And
That year, Jet magazine featured Phyllis on the cover, and the title of the article created a narrative that would come to follow her for the rest of her life. Titled, Phyllis Hyman Wants Love to Match Records. This article would create the narrative that Phyllis was longing and desperate for love and for a man. But this was a carefully curated article from her publicity team, who needed a catchy headline to justify Phyllis being on the cover to the Jet editors. However, it seems as if Phyllis always had someone on her arm, from her now ex-husband Larry to R&B crooner Christopher Williams.
Kareem Akbar. That's right, the educated brother from the bank. He's the real head of the CMB.
Yeah, that one. Phyllis was rarely without a partner. But having a man didn't mean Phyllis wasn't lonely. At this time, she was exhibiting signs of depression and addiction. She would stay out all night, sometimes even falling asleep in the middle of her performances. During this time, Phyllis was featured in many men's magazines. She graced the cover of Players multiple times and also posed nude for We. But once the pictures came out, Phyllis lost her endorsements and Clive decided to take a step away from her. This would send Phyllis into another spiral, and she started diving deeper into substance abuse. In January 1983, Sophisticated Ladies closed on Broadway. For 2 years, Phyllis had a steady gig, doing 8 shows a week, but due to the producer's decisions to pull financing from the show, it was gone in almost an instant. So Phyllis had to get another job. She hadn't been consistently recording since her last album, and without the steady paycheck, she had little income coming in. So she began doing shows while recording her 6th album. Goddess of Love was released in May 1983 and peaked at number 20 on the R&B charts. Phyllis thanked Clive in the liner notes, stating he was right, as always. But by the time that the album came out to meager success, he was done with her. But that was all right with him. He found someone else who would take her place just fine.
She is Dion's first cousin.
Right.
And, but if the mantle will ever pass, even though Lena's as great as ever and Dion is as great as ever, but if the mantle is to pass to somebody who's 19, who's elegant, who's sensuous, who's innocent, who's got an incredible range of talent, but guts and soul at the same time, it will be Whitney Houston, in my opinion.
After Arista A&R Jerry Griffith convinced Clive to come watch her perform, Clive was enamored with this girl from New Jersey. She was beautiful, with the most electrifying voice he had ever heard. Whitney signed to Arista on April 10, 1983, a month before Phyllis dropped her album. Phyllis continuously acted out against Clive, which only pushed him towards trying to create stars out of other artists. Although Phyllis had both the beauty and talent to become a megastar, she craved control and ownership over her life and career. And in her eyes, being a superstar allowed others to have the final say. Even still, Phyllis resented Clive for what she could have been. Whitney was collateral damage. At a big party for the label, the two came head to head.
When they were both signed to Arista, that there was some kind of big party for the Arista artists. And Phyllis was there and was sitting in a stool, and, Phyllis on a stool is like the, a tower, and she was there, and so she said, in the middle of the party, she said, Whitney was a young artist being signed, and she said, somebody brought me in to escort me in, and I'm doing my thing, say hello to people and blah, blah, blah. And then she said, somebody brought her over to meet Phyllis. And so she said, and she just goes, she's just, excited to meet everybody. She said, Phyllis looked her up and down like, looked her up and down. And she said, Phyllis got off the stool and walked around her, to just walk around her and look her up and down. And then she sat, this is what Whitney told me. And she said, she sat down back in the stool. She said, so you're the one. And then Whitney said, and Whitney looked her back in the eye. And Whitney was when I worked with Whitney, that's one thing I remember. She would always look you directly in the eye. She had a very firm handshake too. That Whitney looked at Phyllis and she said, yes, I'm the one.
In the coming months, Phyllis had many gigs around the country in small roles in movies like Too Scared to Scream. But by 1984, Goddess of Love and seemingly Phyllis had fizzled out. The label was all in on Whitney, and Phyllis knew the end was near for her at Arista. She was dropped from the label while still owing $429,000 in debt, still owing back label advances and other expenses.
Davis taught me to never be afraid because I was so terrorized by him. Whether he meant to do it or not, I'll never know. But he sure taught me that if you try to terrorize me again, well, we can't say that on public radio. What I may do to someone who tries to hurt me again in this business, I'm not having it. I should be respected as I respect, and I will not have someone try to ruin my spirit and ruin my career. If Clive Davis, if his plan was to destroy my career, it didn't work.
Even though she was dropped from her label. That year, Steven Spielberg presented Phyllis with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He was adapting Alice Walker's novel The Color Purple and saw her as the perfect fit for the role of Shug Avery. Phyllis aced her initial audition with the casting director, leaving a strong impression. But when it came time to audition in front of Spielberg himself, her nerves got the best of her, and she began to self-sabotage. She tried to take control of the audition, directing Spielberg and attempting to run the session on her terms. Surrounded by seasoned actors like Danny Glover and rising stars like Whoopi Goldberg, her behavior came off as unprofessional and off-putting. Though she'd once been a front-runner for the role, her impression left Spielberg and his team second-guessing, ultimately leading them to cast someone else. She was devastated, but her need for control had once again cost her dearly. Phyllis signed to Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff's Philadelphia International record label. She received a 2-album deal on top of her $50,000 signing bonus. While recording her new album, Dexter Wansel, A&R for Philly International, recalled her saying, "Here I am again recording another album that's not going to go gold." Her past albums not having commercial success affected her as much as she tried to deny it. Although she was afraid of being a megastar, being deemed as a commercial failure didn't appeal to her either. She spiraled into more drug use as her behavior became more erratic. Thoughts of taking her life began taking form, and she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 1985. Phyllis's first record on Philly International was titled Living All Alone. And although Phyllis had a lover at the time, a man 13 years her junior named Tad, she felt alone.
So how is it having a relationship with a younger man?
No, I'm only kidding. Nice.
A couple weeks after Living All Alone was released, Whitney Houston won an MTV VMA for Best Female Video. Whitney's debut album had taken the industry by storm, and Phyllis watched with disdain. Everything Clive and Arista had tried to force out of her had now manifested into a career for someone else. But in order to do that, Whitney had to relinquish control, mitigate her own wants to craft the perfect image, be the perfect pop star. And that is something Phyllis was not willing to do. Living All Alone failed to make it to the top 10, much to Phyllis's chagrin. As much as she hated to admit it, she wanted a hit record. Maybe things would have been different if she had taken Bill Cosby up on his offer.
That he has achieved the kinds of things that he has, because I wasn't even paying him any attention. I liked him. I liked what he did, but I just never thought that he would be the #1 performer, money-making performer in the country.
By 1985, Bill Cosby was at the pinnacle of his career. The previous year, his sitcom The Cosby Show premiered on NBC. It was an immediate success and would win 3 Emmys in 1985, plus a Golden Globe. And Phyllis's cousin Earl played the granddad on the show, Russell Cosby. Anyways, Bill Cosby found himself in the crowd of one of Phyllis's shows. And he was so impressed that he asked her to open up for some of the comedy shows he had lined up that year. There was a catch, though. In order to do the shows, he demanded she lose weight. According to her biography, he allegedly told her, "Television puts 20 pounds on you, and I want you to be as beautiful as I see here. I want to make you a star." Phyllis was obviously offended by the proposition, but she knew how big of an opportunity it could be. She agreed to do the show, but it didn't go well. Likely due to what Cosby said to her. "I want to make you a star," and that sounded like losing too much control to Phyllis. As her first single from Living All Alone was set to be released, Phyllis checked herself into rehab under the name Linda, trying to combat the years of addiction that she had faced. It worked for a while, and Phyllis exhibited traits of getting better. By the time she got back, the album was out. Although it only reached number 11 on the R&B charts, Living All Alone opened doors for Phyllis. After a performance at Morehouse, Spike Lee contacted her to sing and be featured in his film School Days.
Sure I would. You don't pass up opportunities like that. They don't come that often. There are many great singers out there, and for Mr. Lee and his people to consider me, you don't say no. I would never say no, not.
To promote the album, Phyllis headlined a tour, making $10,000 per show, in which she needed greatly as she was still in financial straits. This was a big accomplishment for Phyllis, as she had never headlined her own tour before. But the inner turmoil that stormed inside of her wouldn't let up. She had claimed she quit drinking, but she was obviously still taking pills. She'd performed well on stage, but some nights she was obviously inebriated, which was upsetting to her band and onlookers.
You sing a lot about love.
Mostly about relationships gone bad. I do those very well.
And why is that?
It's something I know about.
Is there a special man in your life right now?
Well,
Phyllis had her fair share of flings. She dated Tad for a few years before they called it quits in 1987, due to Phyllis making him her manager and the power she asserted over him. But in December of that year, she met a young woman named Martha who she was instantly drawn to. Phyllis brought her on the road, and according to her biography, their relationship turned romantic.
I have begun the process of recovery, so to speak, you know, just trying to feel better about myself, regain my
But you
confidence.
seem like the type of person that lives life from one extreme. There's no medium ground
Oh, no,
for
there
you.
isn't. I'm born under the sign of Cancer, and I have a Sagittarian moon and rising. And if you know anything about the signs, that's called extreme highs and extreme lows, and there is no middle for me. It has to be something that has to be worked on. And I'm talking about worked on full time, and that's almost impossible in this sort of work.
In 1990, she attempted to take her life, but luckily her manager Glenda was able to find her before it was too late. Phyllis entered the Willow Rehabilitation Center in Naples, as she knew she was in serious trouble. There, she was able to clear her head and make peace with the things that had happened in her life, at least for a moment.
A survivor. She understands the record business and how to set and follow trends. She demonstrates that ability on her new album, Prime of My Life, and its hit single, Don't Want to Change the World.
Phyllis's next album was titled accurately. Prime of My Life was released in June 1991. The album gave Phyllis her first #1 R&B single, Don't Want to Change the World. The second single, Living in Confusion, peaked at #9. Phyllis toured and made appearances on television for the next couple of years, but her behavior was becoming more and more unusual as the years went on. She was asked to perform at Ella Fitzgerald's 75th birthday celebration and to sing in front of her idol Nancy Wilson, who was also a guest at the show. However, Phyllis showed up to the performance high. She was obviously inebriated and didn't know the song she was supposed to sing. Like with most of the opportunities in her life, her fear and self-sabotaging tendencies got the best of her. And by 1993, the success she saw after the album release was waning. Phyllis had been stuck in a cycle of destruction for many years, and it seemed like everything started spinning out of control, especially after the passing of her mother that year. Although they had their issues, she took her mother's death hard, adding salt to the wound. Her grandmother had passed away only 26 days prior.
Young girls want to know, well, how can I get in the business? You know, what do I have to do? I said, girlfriend, find something else to do. I just don't advise women especially to get into it without them knowing all of the pitfalls. And I guess bottom line is even when they know it, I don't think that's going to deter them. They'll understand it as they go along. There are things they can learn to make their lives a lot easier.
She began to do sessions for her next album, but she was more comfortable at home in her bed. Her mental health was rapidly declining, and she rarely left the apartment other than to work.
Recording artist Phyllis Hyman plays international blues star Etta Mae Pickens, who comes home to help out.
I want to know if this character is half as fun as you are.
Kinda, sorta. Actually, my character is very regal and very... Oh, I'm nothing like that.
One gig she picked up was the musical Blues Bar, in the role of Etta Pickens. This was the first time Phyllis would have to do all of the expectations of a theater actress. In Sophisticated Lady, she didn't have lines of dialogue, only having to remember the song she was performing. For this, she had real dialogue, which was troublesome for her. On top of that, she had gained significant weight, and it was evident to fans.
I can't hold you like I want to. Can't hold you to the promises you made. You won't be here tonight or any other night. It would be a lie to say I'm not afraid. But to be afraid is something that I've always been.
By the time the show was ready to debut in September 1994, Phyllis was not prepared. She didn't have her lines down, and she would periodically divert attention away from the show by doing outrageous things like running away from bugs on stage. On top of that, during a rehearsal for the show, Phyllis fell and broke her foot. While recovering, funding for Blues Bar folded, and she would return to New York. She went back to doing shows, but she wasn't happy, and she was starting to not enjoy the gig life.
I love chitlins. I truly do. So for those of you out in the audience who make chitlins and would like me to have some, please ship them to the BET office. Make sure they're sealed very tightly. They'll freeze them and ship them to me in New York or Philadelphia. Thank you so much.
One night while Michael Jordan was in the audience, he told her she didn't have a man because she was too bossy. Phyllis didn't like that one bit. Fuming from the comment, she threw a pot of chitlins at her valet and assistant. Phyllis was prone to verbally assaulting the people who she worked with, but this was just a bridge too far. Martha moved in with Phyllis in February 1995, but shortly after, the couple would break up for good, leaving Phyllis with more idle time alone in her apartment. While working, Phyllis was often seen reading books and talking to friends about the topic of death. Phyllis began to unravel. She was still recording, although not putting out any new solo material in years. She began to tell folks her plans, calling and letting them know that she was going to end it all. And this time, she would make sure it worked.
Music world tonight, the legendary diva of modern pop, R&B, and jazz, Phyllis Hyman, is dead.
On the afternoon of June 30th, 1995, Phyllis's dealer entered her apartment, this time with sleeping pills. She sent her assistants away from the home, telling them she was planning to sunbathe on her roof. When they left, she went to her bedroom, locked the door, and swallowed a handful, effectively ending her life. She was 45 years old, 6 days away from her 46th birthday, and she was loved. But she didn't go without saying something to the people she left behind. Her note read, "I'm tired. I'm tired. Those of you that I love know who you are. May God bless you."